Hello, everybody. I want to welcome Andy to the SBG podcast. It's a privilege to be able to talk to him. I think most of you probably know who Andy Stumpf is, but in case you don't, correct me if any of this is wrong, Andy, but entered the Navy in 1996. You were on SEAL Team 5. 2002, made the counterterrorism SEAL Team 6 team. 2006, was an instructor at the Navy Special Warfare Program. You had 17 years in the Navy as a SEAL, hundreds of combat operations, and many decorations, including 5 Bronze Stars, 4 for Valor, Purple Heart, and on it goes. So it's an impressive resume, to say the
I don't know
least.
about that. I basically Googled that stuff and just put it in a bio. I don't know how much of that's accurate, but it sounded good to me.
And then for those who don't know, you started training Jiu Jitsu. You started at SBG Montana. When was that, actually?
I was just thinking about that the other day. I think it's creeping up on 2 years. Leah actually posted a picture of my first day that I went in for a class. So I have that. I can look back and find it, but it's within, I think, 60 days of 2 years.
Very cool. And then you've been a blue belt now for a little bit, right?
Yes, I got my blue belt when Frankel was out here last year. I think it was end of August, something like that.
Fantastic. Okay.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really like talking to you about, and we talked about this when we were in Niagara Falls, is teaching and leadership. And you gave a great leadership talk at the camp in Atlanta last year. Was it last year? No, it's last year. Yeah.
It was last year. It was the spring camp.
Spring. Yeah.
Yep.
And those are some of my favorite subjects. And those are also a good percentage of the questions we received, but we've got quite a few. So I'm just going to jump right in and go for it.
Fire away. Like I said, be careful what you ask me because I'll generally answer it.
Well, that's the best part, right? So Dr. John was asking about essential qualities for leadership.
Yeah.
In particular, how you can use those lessons or those qualities in everyday life for just the average person.
Yeah, I think I saw that question. And I think there might have been an aspect of that question. It was, how do you transcend from a professional environment to a personal one? And I spend probably about a third of my year traveling around the world at this point talking about leadership. It's my favorite topic. And I always am very open with the people that I'm talking with that the things that I talk about are not my creation. I mean, it was something that was taught to me generationally through the SEAL community. And the people that taught me, they didn't create it either. It probably goes back, general military leadership principles go back to the times that people picked up sticks and swords and bows and arrows. I mean, it hasn't changed that much. But the amazing thing is that they apply universally, at least in my opinion. There actually is no such thing as military leadership. You have 2 types and 2 choices. There's good leadership, which is effective, and then there's bad leadership, which is ineffective. And any title that you put to that, that's, to me, I've always noticed it's a little bit of an excuse. Like, oh, I have to lead this way because I work in this sector. It's like, nah, not really. You can lead effectively and well, or you can't. But beyond, the military is obviously rank driven, as you know. And it's structured. There's a ladder, just like there is in the corporate world. And people often think that if you don't have a leadership position, that you don't have an opportunity to lead. And that's another thing that I always make a point of addressing when I'm speaking publicly is you have an opportunity to lead 24/7, regardless of who you are and what you are doing. Because if you don't have a leadership position, you can always lead by example. And that has to do with how you conduct yourself. And that ties into the question that was asked, the leadership characteristics. And the first one that I think all of them are really, pinned in the ground to is humility. And that's not to say that you shouldn't have an ego, because I think we can all agree that's impossible. And the person that tells you, hey, I don't have an ego is probably the one you should use with the most caution, because they just told you it's massive.
Right.
But you should have to keep it in check. And you need to keep it from interfacing with your decision-making process. That's the danger of ego. So, if you can be humble, you can be a little bit more objective about who you are, how you're acting, your actions and behaviors on your subordinates or the people around you. If you're not in a leadership position, maybe it's just your friends and family. So it's, humility. Accountability is the next one that we harp on. And that's just the willingness to raise your hand and say, hey, I fucked up. Like, this is on me. And it's so easy to sit there and talk about being accountable. And especially in the world that I came from, it's so hard to stand up in front of your peers that are A-type driven, that have been screened and refined throughout a career, that are high performers, and to raise your hand and be like, yeah, you guys all remember when that sucked? That was my fault. That was on me. But you have to be able to do that. And especially as a leader as well. And, it's very easy to say, when the team is successful, you give your credit to the team. And when the team fails, as a leader, you step up and you shield them from that, that doesn't mean you don't hold them accountable, but it means that you stand up as the leader and take accountability for the shortcomings. Clear and concise guidance is another characteristic that we focus on. And a lot of that is driven, I think, because we talk on the radio often. We're almost always disaggregate. For me to be in a room with more than one or two people that I'm working with would be pretty abnormal. Mm-hmm. And we could have people all over the place. And the more you talk over a radio, I swear they're designed to work less effectively, the more words that come out of your mouth.
Yeah.
So if you want to rattle off a Steinbeck novel, halfway into that thing, people don't even know what you're talking about. So refining all of your guidance down to something that's clear and concise. And for people in a professional setting, if you go to your people and say, let's sit down and let's talk a bit over coffee. I want you to explain to me what you think the roles and responsibilities of your job are. If they can't give it back to you in a clear and concise manner, then you have work to do from a leadership perspective. Because if your people can't tell you what their job is or the roles and responsibilities of their job, they're probably going to struggle in the execution of that. Mm-hmm. And that one also applies both personally and professionally. The more clear and concise you can be just in your communication with people, the less likely, that there's going to be things that are lost in translation. And then the last one, for a characteristic that we screen for in the community when it comes to leadership, is control of your emotions. And this is another one where people will think I'm saying be an autonomous robot. And it's actually the opposite of that. I think you have to be we're human beings, right? We're an emotional creature. I think we need our emotions to, it ties into our morality to a degree. But sure, just like when it comes to humility and ego, you can't let that override your decision-making process. So it's okay to be scared. And when people tell me that they're like, when I was in combat, I was fearless. And it's like, really? Were you? Because it kind of sucks and it's kind of scary. So how about we just say, there's fear present, but instead of allowing the fear to control me, I maintain control of my emotions. And it allows you to objectively work through problems instead of emotionally making decisions. And in my opinion, at least, there's really no benefit to having your emotions tied to your decision-making process. There's no upside, but the downside is basically a trapdoor that could be unlimited. So it's a long-winded answer to his question, but it's humility, accountability, clear and concise guidance, and control of your emotions. And that applies personally and professionally. And people, if you want to be a good leader and have a leadership title, the best time to start practicing those things is right now when you're not in that position. Mm-hmm. And then you'll be prepared.
Yeah, it reminds me of what I'm always talking about with Jiu Jitsu as it relates to fundamentals. They transcend the environment. These are good rules for everybody, for everything.
Yep. Doesn't matter what you do.
When you were on the job, did you have soldiers that came to you after a combat mission that maybe privately had felt some sense of shame or wondered if they were in the wrong job because they had gotten scared?
It wasn't. A lot of the times, those conversations do happen for sure, but it almost would be, I think they would bottle them a little bit until we got back from overseas. And a lot of those conversations would occur in bars.
Okay.
Strip away a few of the, the societal layers with about, I don't know, anywhere between 12 to 26 cocktails. I mean, it's amazing the conversations you can have.
Right.
I never had anybody express that to me overseas. I did have people that would want to come and talk about decisions that they had made, and they were curious as to whether or not they had made the correct decision.
Mm-hmm. What was your answer to people like that generally? I know you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, but somebody that came to you and said, and was expressing, because I used to hear this quite a bit from younger fighters.
Yeah.
That would have their first fight in the cage and then think after that they would feel bad because after that they would still have the same situation where a week prior to the fight they couldn't sleep. And I would just explain to them, it's just your body. It's just natural.
Yeah. When people would come to me, and, I went to people when I was younger as well, towards the tail end of the career, people are coming to you. And I absolutely went and sought guidance from people when I was younger. And, the first thing, when it came to making decisions, the first thing that I would ask them was to explain the situation to me through the lens of the information they had at the time when they made the decision. Because oftentimes when they were coming to me questioning whether or not they had made a decision, what they were adding to the narrative were things that they did not know in the moment that they had to decide.
Yeah.
And it's, you don't have that much time to make a decision overseas. Sometimes you really do. You can watch people for a long period of time. You can watch them develop their pattern of life so you can see things that are atypical. And then sometimes you come around a corner and there's somebody standing there. And if you were to have a half of a second to make a decision, that's a really long time. I mean, some of them are just complete rote snapshot decisions based off the information that you have. And so I would always start them with, explain it to me via the information that you had. And then let's look at that, the decision that you made based off the parameters that we are trained to work within, the legal parameters that overlay on top of that. And I never had somebody at the end of that who was questioning at least the morality or legality of their decision, because I found that they were adding things that were external after the fact,
right.
Which it's not a perfect system. People think that war is a scalpel, and it's not. It's probably a rusty, shovel at best. It's, it doesn't cut clean.
Right. From Ray, Ray Price, I think, right?
I have never met Ray Price, but I know who he is.
Yeah, he's in Reno there. So his first question was, what is your everyday carry and why?
Isn't he a cop too?
He's a cop, yeah.
Of course he is, yeah. God. So I'll answer this, and then Paul Sharp can go bananas in the comment section, because I like SIGs.
Okay.
But I was also issued SIGs since, the 90s. And before people lose their mind and we start, like, oh, what about the caliber and this, that, or the other? I actually don't. I like SIGs because they fit well in my hand. And for me, when people ask me about everyday carry, that's what I start with. I'm like, how big is your hand? Like, go to a gun store, and before I tell you anything about caliber or brand, just go pick up like 10 guns. And if you find one that fits better in your hand, then start the path that way. Don't back yourself into a gun because of a caliber, which is kind of, people are like, oh, I need a 40. I'm like, why? And they're like, I don't know. I saw it on a movie. I'm like, well, that's dog shit. You don't need that at all. Like, you need to be able to shoot it comfortably.
Right.
Or they want to get like a full size pistol, but they want to have it for a concealed carry. It's like, hey man, you're going to need a backpack for that thing 24/7. So I have always liked the way SIGs fit in my hand. And the gun that I have two versions of it, but it's the SIG 365.
Okay.
And then I have the SIG 365 XL, which has a red dot sight on it. They're not that much bigger than each other. I think one's maybe a half of an inch longer, but the same frame width. And I like it because I have 12 rounds in the magazine plus, one in the chamber. So 12 plus 1. It comes stock with night sights, which I like. I'm an advocate of, half of every day occurs in a lower than normal light environment or a lower than daytime light environment. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to conceal, and it's super comfortable in my hand. And
Excellent.
9mm is most law enforcement agencies use it. It's a very common round. You're not going to have to go searching for 9mm, where I've seen, shortages of 10mm and 40 and all that stuff.
Sure. He had another question that I actually think is a really interesting question, because when we were in Niagara Falls, we talked about, and I've heard you talk about this before in your podcast with different people, how you would get inside when you were a trainer there for the SEAL teams, how you would get inside people's heads by getting them to think big as opposed to thinking small every day.
Yep.
So the first part of his question was that something you came up with, or was that also something that was taught to you?
That was something that was taught to me, and I didn't realize the power of it until I went back as an instructor, because I didn't understand why so many students quit. As a student, you're running along and like you're running 9 miles a day just for food. It's 1.5 miles back and forth to the chow hall, and you'll go there and you'll run there and you'll come back and you're a guy was in your boat crew. You're like, where'd Bob go? Well, Bob had a change of heart when it came to occupation, but you never see him again. You don't get to sit down and be like, dude, what are you doing? Like, why'd you throw in the towel? As an instructor, I got to spend a ton of time with the students after that decision. And they are in some of the lowest points of their life. And I found that they were actually really honest with why they decided to quit. And most of them just got overwhelmed. So I didn't realize how many people were making decisions for that reason until I became an instructor. But right before Hell Week, the first time I heard about keeping my world small was from a guy who had if you get injured in buds, which is not uncommon, they don't kick you out. They're going to at least give you some time to rehab, and then they'll restart you with the next class that comes through at the point with which you were injured in training. So if you make it through Hell Week, they just start you at the next class right after Hell Week. And, in training, when you're brand new, you wear a white shirt and your name is stenciled on it in black. When you make it through Hell Week, you wear a brown shirt. So there's white shirts and brown shirts. And this brown shirt was kind of just talking to the class about what to expect going into Hell Week. And the instructors don't try to stop that at all. They're totally fine with people sharing information. And he's like, hey, man, don't think about this it starts Sunday evening, it ends Friday afternoon. He's like, do not think about this from how many hours you have to go or how far you are, where you are and where you want to be in that distance. He's like, just try to make it to the next meal. He's like, you guys are going to get fed every 6 hours. And it was accurate. It's 6 a.m., noon, 6 p.m., and midnight. He's like, just focus on that. And if that's too much, just try to make it through the evolution that you're going to be doing. Most evolutions are going to be about an hour. Try to make it through that hour. You can really just take that down as far as you want to go make it through. If an instructor's yelling in your face, make it through that minute, and then worry about what comes next. But it really helped because it makes your goal so much more achievable. It's right there in front of your face instead of a mile down the road. Sure. And it's amazing the impact that it has. It really does help. And
you must have had instructors try and get you to think big picture as well, right? When you were coming through, how did you handle that?
Anytime an instructor was talking to me, my singular goal in life was to get them to talk to somebody else. So I was just trying to survive the exchange. Right. Because most of the time they're not sitting there like, hey, Andy, how do you feel about this? Or just like, blah, 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 blah. So my goal in life was to survive that interaction and then and move along. That's really all it was.
Okay. Yeah. You kept it small.
Yep. And it helps me, I'll see people all the time doing Fight Gone Bad, a workout in the gym, which is, 1 minute of an exercise, you layer up 5. So it's 5 minutes of work and generally a minute of rest. And you do it for 5 rounds. And the difference in focusing on only the exercise you're doing versus how many rounds you still have to go, it'll impact your score. It'll impact your performance. It'll impact whether or not you're going to make it all the way through it. I mean, I've never cornered a fighter, but I don't think if you're in your first round, it's probably a good idea to think about the 5th one. If it's a title fight, I mean, it's applicable to financial goals or weight loss goals or fill in the blank. If you can just rip it down to something that is ultra digestible, you can start layering successes and build momentum in a positive direction.
Yeah, I could see it being completely applicable to things like diet. So what meal am I having right now?
Or, we do open mats for 2 hours on Sunday in Montana.
Yeah.
I don't think a second beyond the person that I'm rolling with. I'm not thinking about who I'm going to roll with 4 rounds from now because there's no value to that. Or if I'm 5 rolls in, I'm like, oh my God, I'm so tired. Am I going to be able to do this for another 90 minutes? I don't waste any time thinking about that. I just take it one at a time. It's again, applicable across the board.
So the follow-up question to that, and both Ray and I have talked about this ourselves, is, it was interesting too, because I just watched by coincidence the other day your interview with Heron, which was good. Or not Heron, I'm sorry, Henner.
Yep.
And I agreed with pretty much everything he said. And he was talking about how he thinks the Gracie Academy is the best at onlining people and not weeding them out. I think we do a pretty good job at that at SBG too. We didn't used to. Yeah. But the last 10 years or so, Travis, myself, and the other head coaches have tried to model that because those are the people we want. Those are the people I want to have training. So in a way, it's kind of we have the opposite goal. I'm not interested in weeding anybody out. We're trying to keep those people in the gym. And in that kind of environment, when you're instead of trying to get in people's heads and get them to think big picture, you're actually trying to reverse that process and get them just to think about what they're doing at the moment. Yeah. How do you navigate that?
I have found it, especially with myself, when I'm new to an activity, you're a lot of the times reliant upon somebody with more experience to explain to you how it's going to go, right? This is what you can expect. And you can really help people that are new by laying out for them, in my opinion, at least, an architecture or a framework. So there are more knowns than unknowns. Now, this is what you can expect. This is what you could probably expect to feel. Explain to them when it comes to jiu-jitsu, explain to them the frustration that they're going to feel. Explain to them what success is going to look like, because it's going to look like you got a little bit better, not you're dominating somebody your third day on the mat versus, your first. And I would take the time as somebody onboarding to really, because they're not going to know how to lay out their long-term goals because they don't have the knowledge. So take that time to lay out for them maybe the first month or 2 months of goals, and it's digestible. They know what to expect. And then what they'll do is that, they'll hit those little micro wickets. They'll recognize that's going to reinforce that positive direction. And by 2 months, I would imagine you've obviously been teaching this for years, but if you're there for 2 months, you probably have decided whether or not you're going to like it.
Yeah. We lose people for 60
days. And then you can probably start interfacing with them more and, involving them in that goal setting. But I think education up front is probably the biggest thing. Yeah. And in a controlled environment. God, Travis has some pretty comical stories about people's first days on the mats or just his own first days, or, and I can't imagine. Basically you retained a special type of person. It sounds like in the early days, there was a very narrow set of people that were going to stick around, and that's awesome, but not as a business model. No. Not if you want to grow, and not if you want to get a large segment of the population participating in something that I think could drastically change their life, if not save their life. And, the only way that you're going to be able to do that is that gradual approach, like the foundations. I think that's awesome because that's their educational portal, but they also get introduced a lower intensity. They have that 2 months to kind of figure it out. And then it's, you can turn the nozzle on a little bit more and more and more after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes I've heard other jiu-jitsu instructors who might draw the opinion that we made those changes strictly for business. But in reality, I've told people this before, especially people who are still teaching more akin to what I taught 15 years ago, is if I won the lottery and didn't care at all about how much money the gym was making, I'd teach it exactly the way I do now, because I do feel bad that there must have been thousands of people that came through my door around the same time as Travis did over those 3 or 4 years, and how many of them would have just loved jiu-jitsu and got the wrong experience. So
you almost have to do that. You almost have to do that to have the appreciation for the way you're doing it now. And to those people who would say, hey, you're only doing this for the business aspect, well, guess what? It's good business. And it's okay to teach something that you love, that's empowering and impactful, and still make a living. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the athletes now are better than they were, every year our athletes get better. So I'm happy with that whole process. Henry asked a question, and his was more general, but it's a great question. And his version of this question is one of the questions I'm sure you must hear all the time, because I got lots of variations of this, which was staying calm in stressful situations.
I saw Henry's question, and he was awesome. So I met him in Vegas, and he invited me over to his house. And what he leaves out is that he was teaching me, he was trying to tighten up my scarf hold. And I didn't have a choice but to be calm when he had me in his scarf hold, because I thought if I moved, I was going to die.
Right.
So,
super heavy.
But he's phenomenal. And I saw that question and I thought a lot about it. And I think that one for me probably ties to the amount of time we spend in the water. Because if you spend any amount of time in the water, you're going to realize that it's so incredibly unforgiving. And the test that I taught as a BUD/S instructor, so there's 3 phases. One of them is just largely physical. It's basically 10 weeks of learning nothing except for running, pull-ups, push-ups, swim, that type of stuff. And then in the second phase, we start teaching a little bit, and we start applying and administering a diving test. And it's an entire week of testing. And we start off really simple. It's a 1-to-1 ratio the entire time. So 1 student, 1 instructor. You jump in with your scuba gear on, you take it off, you put it back on. That's it. That's the first test. The second test is we black out your mask. So we're applying a little bit more stress. Third test, 2 people go in together, but there's only 1 set of gear, and you take the gear off of one person and exchange it to the other. And now, mind you, in all these tests, there is a protocol that you either follow to the letter or you fail immediately. It doesn't matter if you get the gear on correctly out of sequence. It's the sequence that actually matters in the procedure. And so the fourth test, both people go in together, but they both have blacked out masks on and they have to maintain physical contact. And let me just tell you, there's nothing funnier than when they lose physical contact and they start searching for each other in opposite directions. It's amazing. It's hard to actually be their safety supervisor because you're like tears are coming inside of your mask. You're laughing so hard. It's unbelievable.
They're in a pool?
They're in a pool. Yeah, they're about 10 feet underwater.
10 feet, okay.
Yep. And as an instructor, I'm sitting there in a wetsuit and a snorkel and a dive mask. And I'm just hovering over the top of them. And all I am watching for is procedural errors. And, all the tests that I just described so far, there's no real stress except for the stress that the individual puts on themselves. And their number one enemy is panic. Mm-hmm. If they, you start to panic in the water just doesn't care. It's so unforgiving. But at the end of the week, we do a test called pool competency, and you get four attempts at it. And the instructor will come down and introduce breathing and equipment malfunctions. It's an old regulator that has a hose that only is an inhalation side, and there's a hose that's an exhalation side. And I can crimp both just individually with my hands. So I can interrupt your airflow or I can interrupt your exhalation, which actually trips a lot of people out. You'd be surprised how many people, when they try to exhale and it's resistive in their mouth, it freaks them out because all you have to do is exhale through your nose or breathe around your mouthpiece. But again, it's a weird environment and they're under stress, and common sense certainly is not a common virtue in those environments. And we'll tie knots in the gear, and everything is procedure based. If I don't rip the mouthpiece out of your mouth as a student, you have to start your procedure to find the error at a very specific spot. If I rip the mouthpiece out of your mouth, you start at a different spot. There's no deviation allowed in any of those things. And that test is really hard because the way that I just described it might seem simple, but we're up there as an instructor. I'm controlling when this person is able to breathe. And they know that the test can last up to 20 minutes, but they don't have a stopwatch. Mm-hmm. And we're rolling them and we're interrupting their breathing. And I can see when they are inhaling and exhaling based off the bubble. So if I want to really put somebody into the corner of what they can tolerate with their stress, I can keep interrupting their breathing cycle, and you can physically see it. They start shaking. They'll start planting their feet on the ground. And the worst thing they could do is try to rock it to the surface and hold their breath, because the oxygen or the air will expand. You risk an air gas embolism and introduction of an air bubble into your bloodstream. Nothing good comes from any of that. And that test has nothing to do with diving. At the end of it, I actually would sit the students down and be like, listen, you guys just passed a test that is based on procedures and following procedure under stress. It has nothing to do with your ability to dive. So do not go out this weekend and rent a set of scuba tanks because you don't know anything about diving, even though we just gave you a diving test. Mm-hmm. Understand what it is that we were doing. All we were doing was looking at them to see if they could follow procedure regardless of the amount of stress that is applied to them. How do you do that? You stay calm. That's really the key to that test, is controlling your panic, because you will be panicked. You will want to breathe, but you're not going to be able to. And if you spend enough time in those environments, you kind of just understand that there are things that you can control and then there's things that you can't. And I could never control when the instructor was tying a knot or when they would rip the mouthpiece out of my mouth, but I could always control the pace with which I moved. I didn't need to move frantically. I could actually move slowly and controlled and smooth, which in the end almost always netted a better result anyway.
Sure.
And it's repetition of all of those things. One of the common sayings in the SEAL teams and probably a lot of tactical communities is slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
Yeah.
People try to, they'll see a sexy movement. And I could probably equate this a little bit to jiu-jitsu, people watching these bizarre movement patterns on YouTube 100%. And they want to, and they'll want to try that, but they can't shrimp.
Right.
And so maybe they'll land that super high percentage or a super low percentage, like high flash value move,
right? But
they're going to get smashed on anybody who has any clue with what's going on. And they'd be so much better served just learning how to focus on your defense or learn how to do very basic fundamental things that work all the time, every time, and get so comfortable there that it doesn't matter what people are doing to you because you are in control of yourself. And that's the overlay for me.
That is 100% good jiu-jitsu. So you survived under Henry's head and arm? That's brutal.
I don't know how hard he put it on me. He was kind of just working on – his exact words were, the people that you roll with are going to hate you, so come here and let me teach you something.
Yeah. Not wrong.
No, he was awesome. And yeah, I mean, there's no benefit to freaking out. I've yet to be in an environment where anything is improved by either getting too emotionally involved with it or just moving ridiculously fast. And the reality is, I don't know much about jiu-jitsu. I think I was talking to Lee about it the other day. Most of the time, what I'll do is if I don't know what to do, I do nothing. I just sit there and I play possum because I mean, I can't speak for anybody else's journey, but I don't know how many times I've been in like side control and I'm like, why can't I think of the 50 options from here? And it's because I'm trying to think of 50 options. I'm overwhelmed by the number of things.
Yeah.
So I'll just sit there and I'll try not to move. And most of the time people will get frustrated and then they will move. And I can get back to somewhere that I understand.
Yeah. No, that's actually a really good strategy. There's a stage when you get, like, if you have a very strong athletic person come into the gym, and they have no jiu-jitsu, they can be a pain in the ass because potential injury. You don't exactly know how they're moving. There's no chance that they're going to tap you out, but it just be a rough roll. And when they get to be beginning blue belts to blue belt, they're almost easier to deal with because if you're a brown or black belt, you can predict their movement. But if you don't know what to do, and instead of making a mistake, which it would probably be if you don't know what to do, you just sit there and be calm, you can actually kind of hamper that advantage that the upper belt's going to have. So it's actually a good strategy.
I just sit there and play possum. I'll try to close my eyes, pretend like they choked me out.
Yeah.
Surprise.
So Hickson talks a lot about breathing. He makes a big point of it. Every time I've seen him teach, he'll start the seminar. He will actually say that he believes breathing is the most important aspect for his jiu-jitsu. And some of our coaches, Henry, of course, and then Glenn and John Frankel, especially this last year, have kind of taken a dive into breathing so that they can teach it more, and we can work on that more. But was there any specific breathing techniques that they used in the military when you were in there?
You know, there wasn't when I was in. I know that some guys have talked about Wim Hof type stuff, but that was after my time. But I don't know if I ever really focused on my breathing. I always tried to keep track of when I was starting. Like for me, I can always tell when I'm starting to get a little bit excited because I'll feel like my face is flush. Mm-hmm. That's one of the first warning signs. That's what I use it as, at least in my old job, because if I felt that, I knew that my vision would start to tunnel a little bit. I was just getting too involved in whatever was directly in front of me. And I didn't have like a breathing technique per se, but I would try to stay ahead of that. And if I can keep myself breathing most of the time out of my nose, I have found that it helps me stay out of that environment. And mm-hmm. I think about that rolling as well. I just try to stay really in tune with, I guess it would be what gear my body is in, and try to keep it as low as possible.
Excellent. Another question I'm sure you hear all the time, and I actually get asked this sometimes at seminars, but how common do you think, or how common was hand-to-hand combat for when you were overseas?
I get this one all the time. If you got to a place where you needed to physically defend yourself with your hands, more often than not, it was because you made an error. Mm-hmm. It shouldn't, I mean, there are not any that I am aware of military units that specialize in closing with their enemy and engaging in hand-to-hand combat.
Right.
That's why you carry a primary weapon and a secondary weapon. It's not something, it's not a Rambo movie or fill in the blank, John Wick. The only time we would ever put hands on people is when we were going to detain them. And we used flex cuffs because they were easier to carry. So just, plastic ties. But having said that, I look back and I've physically been there where compliant people had too much pressure applied to them, mm-hmm. and they became non-compliant, not because they had any intention other than to try to save their own life. If you are 200 pounds and you put 80 pounds of gear on and put your knee in somebody's ear hole lightly, they're probably going to freeze. If you point load their ear hole, they're probably going to freak out and start kicking.
Right.
The next thing you know, you might be in a lethal encounter that you might legally be justified because you could justify it as a hostile act or hostile intent, but you actually induce that. And I can definitely think back on times where better understanding of just position, pressure, just control would have definitely benefited. Now it was a little different because I had shit hanging off of me everywhere, but it's not an insurmountable obstacle. But it would have helped for sure. I've physically been there when some of those situations have turned in the directions that they shouldn't have. And it wasn't the individual's fault. It was because we would have been better served with a little bit more training.
Sure. Yeah. Follow-up question. What aspects of your previous career have you brought that helps you be a better learner for the other activities that you do, like jiu-jitsu?
I personally don't think that being a SEAL helps me at all when it comes to jiu-jitsu. And you've probably seen every walk of life come into the gym. I think having a robust wrestling background, if I had been a wrestler for 17 years, yes, I think that would probably have helped me a little bit. But right. Guess what? I wasn't a wrestler. And wrestlers suck, and they should have to wear a sign around their neck.
Right. What about learning in general?
Well, learning in general, that's the point I was going to get to. Most of the career, specifically the workup, is broken into 2-week chunks, maybe 4 on the long end, which actually really mirrors the foundational curriculum, specifically at SBG Montana. We do 2-week cycles, and it goes throughout a year. Mm-hmm. And being a SEAL is like, you're a jack of all trades. And I would say you're maybe 80% proficient at any given time, because as you're increasing, we'd go out to the desert for a month. That would be one of the longer trips. And we're shooting every day, and we're patrolling, and we're doing land nav, and that's awesome. But every day that we're doing that, our ability to dive is going down, or our medical training, unless we're integrating that, or jungle warfare or Arctic. So it's this constant battle. You'd finish that and you're like, okay, we're going to go do jumping for 2 weeks. And then your jumping proficiency would increase, but the stuff you just learned is now on the decline. So it was this constant cycle of new subject, start at the very basic fundamentals, because we had people who were on their first day on the job and people who were on their 15th, 20th year. And right. They have to work together cohesively. So we focus really hard for 2 weeks, fundamentals, crawl, walk, run, and accelerate, and then switch topics. And, you do that enough times, you realize that the fundamentals are what makes the difference, not the flashy stuff at the end of the day. And the fastest way to become proficient is to get out of your own way. Remove any of your personal bias. Like, well, I read in a magazine that if I hold my pistol like this, it's like, no, just shut up and do what you're told. Right. And from the perspective of, because I owned a gym for a couple of years, and I've taught firearms training. The best thing that people can do to respect, and I would say honor their coaches, is just do what they say. That's really all you need to do, is just take everything that you think you know and put it aside and just do what you're told and listen to your coach. Because there's nothing worse than a coach having somebody come up to you time and time and time again and say, hey, I'm getting stuck in this situation, or this is what I'm struggling with. You give them the correct answer and they go right back and do whatever the hell they want to do. It's the most frustrating thing ever as a coach. Yeah. You actually care about the people, but at some point you're like, dude, just go figure it out on your own. Like, I'm tired of your shit. Right. The best thing you can do to honor your coach and the people that care about you is just do what they say. Focus on the fundamentals and do what your coach says. Because obviously, just because you're a coach doesn't mean you're a good person, but most people in a coaching capacity are there because they care about their people. They're not going to give you bad advice.
Right.
And to me, that's the key to learning.
Yeah.
Remove personal bias, get out of your own way. If Travis says, put your hand over here, put your goddamn hand over there.
Right. That fits in real good with your number one trait for leadership as well, of humility. It reminds me of a story when I was a white belt. Fabio Santos, I was training with Fabio Santos one time, and we had just come back from training with some judo black belts, some big guys that, for me at the time, not being a grappler, were intimidating, and it seemed like they knew what they were doing. And when we got back in the car, Fabio was just endlessly complaining about training judo people. And at first I was like, I would think they have an advantage. They're already doing grappling. They had all the Japanese names for all the movements that Fabio was doing, but that was the problem, because every time Fabio would show them something, they already knew the name of that movement in Japanese. and then assumed in a way that they knew the movement, and they never really did learn the nuances and the Brazilian modifications that Fabio was trying to show him. So he much preferred training somebody like me that had no background.
It's so much easier to train somebody who has a blank canvas as opposed, you're trying to color in between what especially if they've gotten training, because let's be honest, not all training, there's a spectrum of everything. Quality of training and validity of training both fall on that spectrum, and having to paint in the lines, especially for people who are just sunk in on something that is not technically correct.
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's frustrating.
Yeah. Michelle asked, it's kind of a similar question to what we were talking about before, but in a situation where you're trying to motivate people as opposed to trying to get people to quit, you're trying to get them to perform better. How do you motivate somebody who is, the way she phrased it was frozen with fear? But if you're on the job and you see somebody freeze up, which I imagine must have happened a couple times.
It does. And you can't really do much in that moment. That's not really the time or place to try to address somebody, especially overseas. More than likely what you're going to end up doing is you just need to get them to a position of safety. Mm-hmm. And then, you're probably gonna have to step into the position that they were in or do what they needed to do. And that's, it's okay. It's one thing that is, it's never talked about or seen in the movies. They portray often people as either freezing or being like this heroic character, but there's a spectrum of that too. And just because you freeze one day doesn't mean you're not capable of doing something that's incredibly heroic or dangerous, but you take action instead of that danger. And just because you have a history of maybe being a rock star doesn't mean you can't get caught on a bad day and get emotionally overwhelmed. Maybe your hard drive space between the ears is a little bit compressed because you're worried about something back home. You're like, you got into an argument with your significant other. Like, all of those things have an impact. And I've seen, people slide up and down that spectrum, and it should be expected. Just because you're a high performer today does not mean you're going to be a higher performer tomorrow. So addressing it in that moment, you're probably not going to be able to if it's actually like on the job. Sitting down and talking with the people objectively afterwards and be like, hey, and I've done this, like, listen, I've been there. That's what I almost always would open with, to remove any aspect of judgment. And then when you get to a point where people freeze or they can't continue, and this is going to sound like a broken record, I take people back to the fundamentals. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the fundamentals work. And then what you slowly do, you build them back up with incremental successes. It's so easy to overwhelm somebody with stress and make people fail for the sake of failure. And there's no training value. What would somebody get their first day on the mat and you just line up the black belts and smash the guy? They get nothing out of that. Right. And they would hate jiu-jitsu. Right. But if you could get him on there and let him work a little bit and show him a little bit of success or a pathway to success, it's going to be a completely different mindset. So I would layer with these people success on top of success, and then incrementally increase the stress, and also give them the latitude as a human being and understanding, like, it's okay. Like, it's okay to not always be at peak performance 100% of the time. You're a human being. I'm a human being. There's no judgment here. Like, it's a combination of both. And if you get people that have performance anxiety or any other type of anxiety, the answer to solving those things is slow, gradual, incremental exposure to the thing that they're afraid of. Mm-hmm. And again, there's no magic formula, but it works if you can do it incrementally.
Yeah, that's good. You mentioned movies a couple times. Is there a military movie that you think portrayed the reality of it better than another? One that you actually like?
G.I. Jane nails it pretty good.
Okay.
Documentary. It's a joke. It's not okay. You haven't seen that movie, have you?
No.
That's Demi Moore, the first female SEAL.
So that was sarcasm?
Oh, that was about as deep as I can put that on. Band of Brothers series, both the Pacific and the European theater, captures some really, really great aspects of that environment. But 2 hours on TV or a movie, it's so much more intimately complex than those mediums can unpack. Sure. But they capture a little bit. So the Band of Brothers is really good. Opening scene of Saving Private Ryan is unbelievable. There's some cool stuff in Black Hawk Down. I can't think of one that really nails it from soup to nuts, though. I can point at some like they got that element of it correct or that element of it correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love Saving Private Ryan. That was a great one.
Yep.
Do you have anything you want to plug? You're still doing the first responder shirts, right?
Yes. So I saw your guys' order come in as well. I should pick up the second run of those mid to late this week. So I got started or interested in jiu-jitsu from a law enforcement guy in the Flathead Valley. And he's probably the best marketing for, SBG, at least in the Flathead Valley. I mean, I'm talking about Nelson, obviously. He's, the walking pyramid scheme at all times. Yeah, moving and shaking.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad that he got me involved. And there were a couple other people peripheral to law enforcement in the gym. And it's crazy to see the profit in your own land syndrome playing itself out. I mean, those guys, Aaron Westfall is a good example. He just got his brown belt.
Mm-hmm.
The dude's a savage.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that in the best of ways.
Right.
And it's amazing to me how much the law enforcement community is required to physically touch and go hands-on with people. And you have guys like Aaron and Nelson who are in their training and they're trying to get guys in, and it's just they get stuck in that profit in your own land. The people that they work with are like, I don't have enough money or I don't have the time. And I'm sitting there and it's like, this is awesome. I'm really glad that it helped me. I want people to have more tools before they have to reach to a belt. So I was talking with Travis, like, why don't we try to create a scholarship fund to at least remove some of the barriers that people consistently say prohibit them from starting jiu-jitsu, one of them, the main ones being financial. So we created a design, and every penny from the shirts is going towards getting law enforcement first responders on the mat. We've had 6 people sign up so far in Kalispell, and the goal is to continue to grow it and then offer it to every single SBG gym, in worldwide. I could care less as long as it's, helping get the right people on the mats. Doesn't matter to me.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. We'll put a link up on the podcast below so people can sign up there. So before we go, I have a question for you. How'd you get into the squirrel suit?
Yeah. So how did I get in the squirrel suit? So
military, do they do that?
I have thought for probably hundreds of hours on trying to figure out a way that I could finagle my way into teaching military guys to fly wingsuits.
Right.
It would be amazing. And there's not a single military application for it. The suits fly great as long as you don't have a helmet on and a gun and a rucksack and all the other stuff that you would have to have with you, which you're always going to have with you. So there's absolutely no way that I could ever pitch it to a military unit, even though it would be amazing. Just like hop out of a, C-17 at 40,000 feet and go 10, 15 miles would be amazing. Nobody would, probably half the people would die if I'm looking at the experience level of the military jumper, honestly. So I always loved jumping, and I would always go jump at civilian drop zones every time I would get the chance. And I was actually very resistant to wingsuiting when I first saw it because I would only see the guys on the ground. And there's so much fabric with the suits, and on the ground, it's all unzipped. It just looks like a bag of shit everywhere. There's nylon everywhere. They're sweating in the plane because they have all this other stuff on. I'm like, why would you guys do this?
Right.
And years later, I started seeing the videos. I'm like, oh my God, that looks amazing. So I went and tried one. I think I had maybe 3,500 jumps the first time I tried a wingsuit on, and it totally changed. It's not that I was bored with skydiving, but I was comfortable with the things that I was doing in skydiving up to that point. And it went from getting 45 to 55 seconds of free fall to 2.5 to 3 minutes. And instead of horizontal speed, instead of vertical speed, crazy horizontal speed, and the ability to fly next to each other like airplanes. So it actually really reignited a love of skydiving. And the guy who taught me how to fly wingsuits was also the guy who taught me how to base jump. So it was kind of just a natural, seamless integration of the two. But I went into it kicking and screaming like I do on most things. I'm like, I don't want to do that. And the next time I'm like, oh, I love this. This is amazing.
It looks amazing. How many times have you had to cut away when you were in the military?
I don't think I have any military cutaways. All of my cutaways have been with civilian gear. And I think I'm up to either 6 or 7, which statistically they happen, I think, about the mid 800s, 1 out of every 800 and change. So, I'm right on average.
Okay. Interesting. we'll end it on this. So what would you say to somebody who, two things, someone, because I get asked this quite a bit too, and I'm not the person to ask. You're the person to ask this. Young person that comes up to me and says they're thinking about entering the military, what advice would you give them?
First piece of advice I would give them is, given the fact they have almost unlimited access to information, that they should use it. They should research. I'd never try to talk somebody out of it, but I also would never try to talk somebody into it. It needs to be a decision that they make on their own, and I think for the right reasons. And if you don't take an incredible amount of time to research, I mean, you look at BUD/S, the SEAL community as an example. I knew almost nothing about what BUD/S was going to be like when I went there, because there wasn't information available. And the amount of information available on each one of the phases of training, the requirements, the test gates, the likely things you're going to encounter in a career, like it all exists now. So take the time and research it, and make sure that you get as much out of the military as the military gets out of you. There's incredible educational opportunities, vocational skill opportunities. You can go to a variety, I could go to almost any school that I wanted to, whether if I wanted to pursue radios or electronics, I could have gone down that path, or long range marksmanship. And those opportunities are available. But again, you have to search for them, because the military is going to get their pound of flesh. You just need to make sure that you get yours as well.
Mm-hmm. And how would you answer the street versus sport question? So this is one I've also gotten a lot for 20 years, but given your background, someone says, well, I want to train primarily for self-defense, for quote unquote street, and that appears to be a sport. So you have somebody that comes to you with that kind of mindset. What martial art or what direction would you point them towards?
I have a very limited understanding of the rule set when it comes to sport jiu-jitsu. I mean, at a super low level, like I understand the points, but and I'll watch some of the competitions too, and I could understand why somebody, let's say you watched a really high level black belt competition, you're like, well, nothing just happened for 10 minutes.
Right.
But now, and I have an understanding now of all the micro things that are happening, and I could see somebody saying that's not going to help you in the street, but that's a misunderstanding of the level of competition that I think is occurring.
Right.
But also there's some artificiality in that rule set. I did the Gorilla Cup one time, so I have zero competition experience, but I know enough about human behavior that when I see them watching the clock and trying to see if they're up by an advantage or down by an advantage and how that changes, there's an artificial element to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's fine if you want to go that direction. If somebody came to me and said, where should I go for self-defense? I would point them absolutely at jiu-jitsu. And I would say you should probably have a little bit of exposure to striking as well.
Mm-hmm.
You have to, yes, the fight's likely going to start on your feet, but guess what? If you have awesome jiu-jitsu and get knocked out instantaneously, you can tell the doctor about it at the hospital, how badass you are and what color belt you are. Because if you can't get to your jiu-jitsu, who cares? But jiu-jitsu is the route that I would point them. And I would say just ignore the sport aspect of it and just focus on the fundamentals. Because again, in the street fight, I don't think you're going to be pulling off any YouTube moves.
Right.
I think if it comes down to it, if your life is truly at risk, going back to Paul came and did a seminar on, bladed weapons. If you try to pull some YouTube move as opposed to going 2-on-1 on a knife bearing hand, you're going to die.
Right.
Well, you might not die, but you're going to start leaking hydraulic fluid, and that's not going to go well for you.
Right.
It's the fundamentals that are going to save your life. So focus on that. And as you go into your journey, if you find that you love doing sport jiu-jitsu, then awesome, go do sport jiu-jitsu. But I would just caution people as opposed, to use that as their end state. I would just say, focus on the fundamentals. And if you do that, in my opinion, combined with some other stand-up skills, you're going to be great for the street.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well,
and then don't get in fights.
Yeah. That's a good fight too. Well, awesome, Andy. I think that's great. And I appreciate you taking the time to have a talk. And
awesome. Yeah. I appreciate the invite. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Take care.
Have a good one.